Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Jew hatred. As you probably noticed, I actually spend quite a bit of time writing, speaking, and thinking about Jew hatred. A new trend is taking over America. It's called hating Jews. Yep, Jew hatred is now so acceptable in the United States that to be a Jew hater is hip, it's cool, it's trending. A new Gallup poll is telling us that while a large swath of American proud Jew haters, even more people are actually, the majority of Americans actually view the hatred of Jews as a problem. For some, it is even a very serious problem. Gallup conducted a telephone survey between May 30th and June 1st. They spoke to 1,019 adults over the age of 18, and this is what their poll revealed. 9% of the people thought that Jew hatred was a very serious problem. For 48%, it is somewhat of a problem. For 30%, it is not much of a problem. And for 9%, they saw Jew hatred in America as not a problem at all. The exact wording of the question from Gallup went like this: do you think that anti-Semitism or prejudice against Jewish people is currently a very serious problem, somewhat of a problem, not much of a problem, or not a problem at all in the United States? In broad strokes, their results put the numbers of people who see Jew hatred as a problem at 60%. But more importantly, 40% of the people do not think it's a problem. The 40% number is, to my mind, way too high, given the Malthusian increase of anti-Jewish incidents being perpetrated across the United States. I deeply struggle to understand how so many Americans, 40% of Americans, do not interpret these attacks against Jews as harmful to the very fabric of American democracy and an ominous threat to our once peaceful and safe society in the U.S. How do they not connect the dots and realize that this many attacks on American soil of fellow Americans are not simply attacks against Jewish Americans? They are attacks on the United States as a whole. These attacks are broadcast across the media. The left and the right media see it. Allow all people to watch TV or read newspapers or follow news sites or social media to bear witness as anti-Jewish hooligans invade Jewish neighborhoods, attacking synagogues, Jewish schools, and Jewish people. This is not political free speech or protected rights to protest. These are acts of violence and hate crimes as defined by federal and state laws. In 1919, United States Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing in Shenek versus United States, uses a phrase borrowed from a closing arguments of the prosecutor in the lower court case against Shenek. Holmes writes of falsely shouting fire in a theater. That's the exact quote. This was Holmes' way of explaining to the nation that there are limits to free speech, that all speech is not free speech, especially speech that can endanger others, cause a riot, or get people trampled. Speech, like actions, have the ability to kill. There are, of course, times when it is permitted to shout fire in the theater. That is, if there truly was a fire in the theater, or if you sincerely believe that there was fire in the theater. While Justice Holmes often quoted in this line, he's often quoted, it has become almost cliche, the line. That's because, as is the case with many cliches, it rings true. Interestingly, however, over time the cliche has changed to include the word crowded, as in a crowded theater. The word falsely is almost always missing. Going to a Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles wearing keffiyehs and waving Palestinian and Hamas flags is incitement, and incitement is illegal. Battering a Jewish-looking man or boy on the streets of Brooklyn is illegal. Given the drastic rise in Jew hatred unfolding before our eyes, I was both surprised and very pleased to answer the Gallups to another question that they were polling, When asked about voting for a Jewish candidate for president of the United States, 89% of those polled would vote for a Jew. 89%, do the math. 89% is almost 9 out of 10 people answering that they would vote for a Jew for president if the person was nominated by the party. As astounding as that 89% figure is, there is no reason to believe that the number is inflated, unfounded, or untrue. These numbers give tremendous hope in the battle against Jew hatred. They ultimately mean that the people involved in attacks against Jews are statistically an anomaly. They mean that all the hatred spewed and all the attacks perpetrated are the work of a marginal, irrelevant group of people operating outside the mainstream of America. To beat them back, the mainstream, the vast majority, Vox Populi, the voice of the people, needs to stand up and squelch the Jew hatred. The instigators, the inciters, the majority must set the tone. There are essential red lines to political and social behavior that cannot and can never be crossed. The mainstream knows this. Instigators of Jew hatred must be told by their friends, family, politicians, police, and educators, by society at large, that instigating or acting upon Jew hatred is unacceptable and oftentimes illegal. Mass social media campaigns must organize a social movement to ostracize haters of Jews and instigators of hatred against Jews. They must be made to feel unwelcome in our mainstream society. A united front of decent and good people, Jews and non-Jews, people of understanding, people that understand the danger and the vulgarity of the world's oldest hatred, is the driving force that can eliminate this evil from our society. It is not just the best way, it is the only way. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from the Allgemeiner that was written by Ira Stoll and published on June 28, 2024. The column is entitled, Jewish Leader Slams New York Times for Dreadful Bias as Paper Faults Ferocious Israel, Rabidly Partisan Adelson. In this piece, Stoll slams the New York Times for unprofessional bias against Israel, and he is so correct. Stoll, who was one of the two major forces behind the New York Sun, understands the use of a word, the power of even one word, and how the use of one specific word can taint and mislead the reader. This is an excellent critique of the Gray Lady. The Gray Lady, of course, is the nickname for the New York Times, developed in the late 1800s as a way of symbolizing the grandeur of the newspaper, the stately appearance, the serious tone of the New York Times. The paper was the height of culture. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. This is how Stoll begins. For a telltale indicator of New York Times bias, keep an eye on adjectives and adverbs. Two recent front page Times articles offer examples of this particular problem skewing the coverage. A Times article purporting to show how Israelis feel little sympathy for Gazan suffering includes the line, Michael Zigdon, who operates a small food shack in Netivot's rundown market and had employed 2 men from Gaza until the attack, expressed little sympathy for Gazans who have endured a ferocious Israeli military onslaught for the past 8 months. Stoll explains the ridiculous bias of the New York Times. These are not errors, they are points of view. The column continues. The ferocious adjective gets hurled by the Times a second time in the same article, which goes on, in case any reader failed to absorb the point the first time, to say that the death toll in Gaza has spiraled to at least 37,000 since Israel began its ferocious offensive. The Israeli self-defense operation gets described by the Times as ferocious, while the Hamas attack of October 7th earns no such label. My Webster's second defines ferocious as having or exhibiting ferocity, cruelty, savagery, etc., violently cruel. Ferocity is defined as coming from the Latin word ferus, meaning wild, as the ferocity of barbarians. Stoll explains that this is actually slander against Israel. The obvious question now is, How do they get away with it? He continues, that qualifies as slander against Israel, slander of Israel, opinion masquerading as New York Times news writing. If the Times news writers and editors want to accuse Israel of waging barbaric, savage, wild, violently cruel warfare against Gazans, they are welcome to make a factual case for that. I think they'd have a hard time of it, given all the evidence about the care that Israel has used to limit non-combatant casualties. But making the accusation in a backhanded, backdoor way by sprinkling tendentious adjectives into news articles is a kind of deception so subtle that a lot of times readers might not even notice it. Stoll now raises the level of normal critique of the New York Times. He speaks of the moral equivalency issue. This is what he wrote. Usually the Times gets faulted for false moral equivalence between Hamas terrorists and the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, defending the Jewish state. In this case, there's no equivalence. There's just straight out smear of Israelis as ferocious with no parallel negative description of Gazan attackers. Now Stoll adds the more evidence to his thesis, demonstrating again that the New York Times uses terms that are so biased against Israel. He writes, in the same article, Israel's government gets labeled as hawkish and right-wing, while no such descriptions are applied to Hamas or the remaining government of Gaza. Quote, the Times is similarly ferocious in its description of pro-Israel philanthropist and political donor Dr. Miriam Adelson. A front-page article about her declares she is, in some ways, a political carbon copy of her husband, intensely pro-Israel, rabidly partisan, and a believer in the nobility of using her money, north of $30 billion, and her media empire to buy influence and shape the world. Wow. Stoll now goes on to explain that mainstream American Jewish leadership is standing up and taking exception to these words and the bias illustrated by the New York Times. And this is how Stoll explains it. The American Jewish community is already increasingly losing patience with the paper. The CEO of the United Jewish Appeal Federation of New York, a longtime partner of the New York Times in its Neediest Cases Fund, Eric Goldstein, wrote a letter to the editor of the paper faulting the Adelson profile and a Times Online headline that said U.S. Rep. Jamal Bowman had been overtaken by flood of pro-Israel money. Not only does it feed a dreadful anti-Semitic stereotype, it does a disservice to voters in New York's 16th congressional district who made their voices heard loud and clear. Equally troubling was the Times' recent A1 profile of pro-Israel advocate Miriam Adelson, which played upon the same stereotypes. Goldstein's letter said, it faulted the Times for bias. He concludes, quoting Abe Foxman, the former head of the ADL. Stoll writes, likewise, the National Director Emeritus of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, Abraham Foxman, called Bowman headline crude, biased, and disgusting. In another social media post, Foxman wrote, New York Times, you are so obsessed with criticizing Israel that it distorts your news judgment. This was an exceptional piece. Thank you, Ira Stoll. Next up is a column by Ram Ben Ishai from Ynet, published on June 3rd, 2024, and the column is entitled, Cutting Through the Noise. Here are ground truths from Gaza. Subtitled, Analysis, Senior Commanders and Security Officials view military achievements in Gaza as an opportunity to secure hostage deal. Contrary to New York Times claims, they don't support continuation of Hamas rule. This is how Ram Ben Ishai begins. Senior IDF and security officials have told the government that in light of military achievements in the war in Gaza, they would support a ceasefire agreement that would ensure the release of 120 Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. On Tuesday, the New York Times reported that the top military commanders were in favor of a ceasefire even if Hamas were to remain in power in the Palestinian enclave. But that was a partial account of their position. Senior commanders and officials told me that their position was that Hamas must be eliminated both militarily and as a governing force, and that was expressed to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, they said that the hostages must be freed at the same time. This position was the basis of the ceasefire proposal as it was presented by United States President Joe Biden last month. There is indeed a rift between Netanyahu and senior IDF and defense ministry officials, but not because of Netanyahu's refusal to end the war or to release hostages. Ben Ishai explains that Netanyahu has been trying to place blame of October 7th on the IDF and its intel apparatus, as well as the defense ministry. And that has led to a great tension between the two. But there is a larger threat from Hezbollah in the north. IDF wants to deal with that. Ron Ben Ishai writes, the military has no hesitation to confront Hezbollah and urges Netanyahu to work diligently to bring about a safe return of residents evacuated from the north since the start of the war. Ram Ben Ishai concludes, writing, and this is very important, it's because of the miscoverage, the false coverage. He writes, there is no shortage of munitions and spare parts for tanks and bulldozers participating in the fighting in the Gaza Strip. The delay in arms shipment by the United States doesn't create such a shortage either. The IDF is eyeing its supply of munitions in preparation for war against Hezbollah. That could be long. There is no change to the motivation of troops to fight the war, and although there is a slight dip in the willingness of reservists to report to additional rounds of duty, that is hardly impacting the military's deployment. Once again, an excellent piece by Ron Ben Ishai. Thank you so very much for giving us perspective, important perspective. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons, memes, and headlines today. First up is a still of a dead Gazan in a body bag, checking his cell phone. The tagline reads, "It's a miracle." Unfortunately, this is a common occurrence. The truth is that video and photos of dead Gazan bodies are often staged. I have shown you several videos of this in the past on this very show. Next up is a meme of Assad of Syria who says, "I killed over 200,000 Arabs and no one cares because I'm not a Jew." This is actually a very famous and important line and a joke that has been used about Arab tyrants for decades and the critique against Israel. Now a cartoon of Barney Fife from the famed Andy Griffith Show. He was bumbling about humorous, simple, harmless character. In this cartoon, he is the ICC, and he says, "I'm going to arrest Bibi Netanyahu for defending Israel." Sad but true. Now a few headlines. Fetterman gets a standing ovation at yeshiva graduation for removing Harvard robehood. It is remarkable just how unusual things have become. Senator Fetterman has emerged as one of the great defenders of Israel and Jews in the United States today. Who could have predicted that? The next headline reads, U.S. pier constructed off Gaza has broken apart. Actually, it broke on the very first day. Classic, just absolutely classic. And this final headline is a spoof. It's a spoof, I repeat, it's a spoof from the Babylon Bee. It reads, with Biden stalling, Israel announces they will just get American weapons from the Taliban. That is so funny. If you remember the Taliban, the U.S. abandoned over $80 billion of U.S. weapons and handed them over to the Taliban by leaving. And the Taliban are actually selling these weapons on the world market, the weapons market. You can't make this stuff up. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Party suffered a disappointing loss in the French parliamentary elections, garnering 120 to 150 seats in the National Assembly, the lower house of Parliament, far less than the polls had predicted. The alliance of the left-wing parties, the New Popular Front, which also includes extreme left parties, is now expected to become the largest faction in the parliament with between 180 to 215 seats. In the end, after all the pomp and drama, President Emmanuel Macron's alliance of centrist parties stands where it has for years with 150 to 180 seats. The 31-year-old American citizen who was seriously injured by an anti-tank missile that hit a building in Moshav Ze'erit in Western Galilee is an employee of an American civilian company that sold or donated drones to reserve Israeli soldiers on the Lebanese border. The company's employees came, apparently without permission, to instruct the soldiers on the use of the drones and to install some other systems for the drones. The injured American was taken to the Galilee Medical Center in Nahariya, along with an Israeli citizen and a soldier who was in serious condition from the same attack. The Iranian Navy frigate Sahand capsized while undergoing repairs in the southern port of Bandar Abbas, according to Iranian state media. They reported that, and I'm quoting here, as Sahand was being repaired at the wharf, it lost its balance due to water ingress. Fortunately, the vessel is being returned to balance quickly. The report did not specify when the accident occurred, but Iranian state media did have a picture of the capsized ship and indicated that several people were taken to hospital with minor injuries. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has issued an interesting invitation to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Erdogan said, and this is the quote, "We will extend our invitation to Assad. With this invitation, we want to restore Turkey-Syria relations to the same level as in the past. Our invitation may be extended at any time." As background, Turkey severed ties with Syria in 2011 after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, when Turkey supported the rebels looking to oust Assad. We'll wait and see what happens from this. It's a very interesting situation. 3 officials from Columbia University in New York City have been suspended from their positions. They were sending anti-Semitic messages during a forum on Jewish issues this past May. The information comes from a letter sent by university officials, which was obtained by the New York Times. The officials remain employed by the university but have been placed on unpaid leave without a return date and will not return to their previous roles. The IDF has confirmed that an IDF aircraft struck and killed Hezbollah terrorist Mustafa Hassan Salman in the area of Kalia in southern Lebanon. Hassan Salman was the operative in Hezbollah's rockets and missiles unit who took part in the planning and execution of numerous terror attacks against Israel. In a recent speech, President Isaac Herzog praised the U.S. aid to Israel throughout the war in Gaza. Herzog said, and I'm quoting here exactly from his speech, "I remind all of us, the alliance with the United States has proven itself time and again in this war, encompassing steadfast financial support, unprecedented weapons shipments, and intelligence and diplomatic assistance. The President of Israel is truly the consummate diplomat." This is very important. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. As many of you know, many American Jewish communities and people have rallied their communities and members and raised money to support and aid some of the most elite of the IDF units. They donate money for essential equipment and then send the money to the liaison officer of a specific unit they have connected with, who makes the actual purchases. Here's a thank you letter written to a New York Jewish community, written by a lone soldier who grew up in that community and now serves as a commander in one of the IDF's extremely elite units. As the writer thanks the community, he explains where the money went and how helpful it was. I tear up and well up when I read this, so I apologize in advance. More importantly, he explains that just as his unit answered their calling, those who contributed towards his unit's needs answered their calling and are now participants in the effort to defend Israel. It's a very powerful letter. To my dear community, there is no word whose meaning has become so crucial in these long months of war as the word home. Families chased out of their houses on Simchat Torah, hostages that do not know if they will see their loved ones again, and communities that do not know if they have a place to which to return. In all of this turmoil, there are reserve soldiers that, at the moment's notice, voluntarily left behind lives, jobs, and families, heading into armed conflict with one thought in mind: defending our collective home. No thought was given to how and if they will return or what challenges they will meet on the path to achieving this goal. What pushes these soldiers forward is knowing that we strive for the greater good and that the people of Israel are behind us. As soldiers forged forward into the battle without asking for recognition or expecting thanks, the knowledge that an entire people is supporting us added strength. It added light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, rainy nights, and energy in tired legs and shaking arms, and an added infusion of purpose when the days grew long and the combat seemed never ending. For me, knowing that the community in which I was born and raised sees the importance of the work we were doing was a touchstone that I knew that I could always return to. Letters from the children of the community in support and procuring the necessary additions to our supplies and equipment was an invaluable factor in the success of our team. The 551 Reserve Brigade was activated on the morning of October 7th and sent to the Gaza envelope to defend civilians and rout out terrorist operatives that had breached the border. As the war continued, we were leading reservist units in the ground operation in Gaza, facing enemy combatants in Beit Hanun, Al-Atra, Beit Lachia, Jabalia, and other sectors. As the Brigadier Commander Suite, we have been instrumental in leading our battalions to success in combat, even locating the remains of Ziv Dado, Eden Zacharia, Ron Sherman, Dick Baser, and Aliyah Toledano, and returning them to our homeland. We currently are defending the northern border and deepening our preparedness for the next time the state of Israel is called into combat. On behalf of my soldiers, I would like to extend our deepest thanks and appreciation for all that you have done for us. As we followed the voice that called to our mission, we are grateful that you heard the same call. With love and deepest thanks, Commander SM, Commander of the 551 Brigade, Commander Suite. I know this commander. I know him well. And I pray for him and all of his subordinates, their unbelievable bravery. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.